Welcome back to The Unseen Wisdom, where we like to dig into the stories and perspectives that, don't always make it to the front page. Before we really jump in, if you could hit that like button, maybe drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. It really does help, and it ensures you don't miss out on these hidden gems. Today, we are diving deep into South African politics and, more specifically, how it's impacting education.
Okay, that's good.
All this was sparked by a really interesting interview I heard with Siviwe Gwarube, the Minister of Basic Education, on the SMWX podcast.
Yeah, I listened to that one too. I thought it was fascinating, especially considering that, Gwarube is the youngest minister in the cabinet at only 35.
Yeah.
And this is her first time holding a ministerial position, so she's coming at it all with fresh eyes.
For sure, and she doesn't shy away from the tough topics.
No, not at all.
One thing that really stuck with me was how she talked about forming the Government of National Unity, the GNU. She was pretty candid about how chaotic that 30-day period was trying to negotiate with the ANC. I mean, let's be real. They weren't exactly thrilled about losing power for the first time in 30 years.
And she actually compared the ANC to the 5 stages of grief, which I thought was brilliant.
Yeah.
It's a good way to think about it because it humanizes the whole political process. It reminds us that even these seasoned politicians are still just people dealing with really complex emotions.
Yeah. I mean, if one of the major parties is essentially in mourning, how effective can that government even be? It really makes you think, about the future of South African politics.
It definitely speaks to the challenges they have ahead of them transitioning to this more collaborative, multi-party system. But it also highlights the potential they have for change, too. The fact that they were able to form a coalition government at all suggests a willingness to try something new, to move beyond the old ways.
Right. Okay, so let's get into one of the first major policy clashes within this new GNU. The Basic Education Laws Amendment Bill, or as everyone's calling it, the BLA bill.
Yeah, this bill, it proposed some pretty sweeping changes to how education is handled in South Africa. Some elements of it sparked fierce debate, especially the parts about language policies in schools and what role the school governing bodies should play. Oh, and we can't forget the really heated debate around admitting students, specifically foreign nationals.
It seemed like that bill touched a nerve. Do you think that's because it brought some underlying tensions or anxieties in South African society to the surface?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, look, the bill tried to regulate the admission of foreign students, and that really tapped into this South Africans first sentiment that's been simmering for a while now, especially for people who feel like their needs and the needs of their children are being overlooked.
So it wasn't just about the policy details. It was about a deeper unease about who gets prioritized, especially when resources are already so limited.
Exactly. And it becomes even more complex when you look at the state of the South African education system as a whole. Chronic underfunding is a massive problem, and it leads to all sorts of problems: overcrowded classrooms, a shortage of teachers and resources, and at the end of the day, an uneven playing field for students.
Right, and then that's where Gwarube's call for a complete review of government spending comes in, right?
Yeah.
It's like she's saying, hey, let's take a hard look at where our money is going and really ask ourselves, are we actually investing in the future of the nation?
Totally. It's a big statement, and it's a question that everyone in South Africa is asking, not just in the education sector.
And Gwarube doesn't just talk about this stuff abstractly either. She tells this story about visiting an overcrowded school in Mpumalanga. She describes seeing all these kids crammed into desks meant for one person, and you can hear the emotion in her voice as she's describing it.
Yeah, that story is rough, but it really drives home the human cost of all this underfunding. It's so easy to get caught up in all the numbers and the policy debates and forget that these are real kids with real futures who are being impacted by this.
Absolutely. And it really connects to that whole South Africans first feeling we were talking about. Parents see these packed classrooms, hear about how many teaching positions are sitting empty across the country, and of course, they're going to worry about their own kids and what opportunities are available to them.
For sure. Especially with this BLA bill hanging around and all the debate about foreign students. You've got this perfect storm, limited resources, growing demand. And then you add in this wave of kids coming from other countries.
And this is where Gwarube's position gets really interesting, right? She doesn't pretend that anxiety and frustration isn't there. In fact, it seems like she's leaning into it, pushing for more accountability and policies that really put South African citizens first.
It's a tough balancing act, no doubt about it. She's got to stick to the principles of equality and non-discrimination, but she also can't ignore the very real concerns of the people she's representing who feel like they're being squeezed out.
It's like she's trying to walk this tightrope between all these competing pressures while staying true to her own vision for South Africa.
And her vision is clear. South Africa needs to get its house in order before it can start helping others. That means really investing in education, making sure every South African citizen has access to quality schooling, and creating a system that helps future generations thrive.
It's a powerful message for sure. And it leads to some big questions. Is her approach politically viable? Can she actually navigate this whole coalition government situation and deliver on these promises? What are the risks of this South African's first approach?
Oh yeah, tons of questions worth thinking about. And I think anyone who's trying to make sense of the political scene in South Africa needs to understand Gwarube's perspective, why she's doing this, and the challenges she's up against.
I agree. And as we dig deeper into this deep dive, we're going to be unpacking all of those questions and more. But before we do that, let's take a quick pause to recap what we've talked about so far. We've seen how the whole GNU formation process and the BL bill have really revealed both the fragility and the potential of South Africa's political system.
We've also seen how this chronic underfunding has basically created a crisis in education. All those overcrowded classrooms, teacher shortages, and the growing sense of anxiety among parents.
And we've started to unpack Gwarube's vision for South Africa, more equitable, more prosperous, with a focus on putting South Africans first and investing in the future of the nation.
Yeah. So as we move forward, let's keep all of this in mind as we explore how Gwarube's experiences, the challenges she's facing, and her vision for the future might shape South Africa's education system and ultimately the country as a whole. Picking up where we left off, I think it's really important to acknowledge the huge responsibility that Gwarube has taken on here. It's not just about policies and budgets. It's about the hopes and dreams and fears of literally millions of South Africans who see education as the way to a better life for their kids.
Oh, absolutely. It's a lot to carry, for sure, especially in a system as complex, let's face it, as burdened as South Africa's. You mentioned this idea of a perfect storm brewing. Can you explain that a bit more?
Of course. So we talked about the limited resources and the growing demand, right? Both of those things are made worse by historical inequalities that are still very much present today. And then you add on this influx of students from neighboring countries, many of whom are looking for a better life or running from really tough situations.
And I imagine that adds fuel to that South Africans first sentiment, doesn't it? I mean, especially when people already feel like the system is barely keeping up with the needs of its own citizens.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes the BL bill so controversial, especially its attempts to regulate foreign student admissions. Some see it as a much-needed step to protect South African children, while others think it's discriminatory and unfair.
It's a tough spot to be in, for sure. It forces us to look at some uncomfortable truths about who gets what and who gets prioritized. But stepping back for a minute, what does all of this mean for teachers on the ground? They're the ones in those overcrowded classrooms every day.
Yeah, it's got to be an enormous burden. Imagine trying to teach effectively when you have 60, 70, even 80 students packed into a classroom designed for half that many kids. There aren't enough resources. The needs are just too great. It's overwhelming. It's no wonder that teacher burnout is such a big problem in South Africa.
Right. And then you pile on the administrative work, the lack of support staff, the constant pressure to make do with less. It all leads to exhaustion, frustration, and ultimately a lower quality of education.
Exactly. And that's where Gwarube's push for a government spending review becomes even more important. If they really want to get to the bottom of this crisis, they have to be willing to put money into the system, the teachers, the buildings, the resources, everything that's needed to provide quality education.
It's a long game for sure, but it's not something South Africa can afford to ignore.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the anxieties, the need for investment. But what about Gwarube's proposed solutions? How is she planning on getting things done and actually making a difference?
Well, a big part of it is her commitment to transparency. She believes that by being honest with people about the state of education, the good and the bad, she can build trust and encourage everyone to work together to solve problems.
It's kind of refreshing to hear a politician say they're going to be transparent, isn't it? It feels like so often they're more worried about looking good than actually fixing things. I know, right? It shows that Gwarube really understands how important communication is. By admitting there are challenges, she's asking people to be part of the solution and have a real conversation about how to move forward.
And it's not just talk either. She's also demanding accountability from the education system itself and the government as a whole.
Right. She's not afraid to hold people's feet to the fire. She wants to see results, make sure resources are being used the right way, and that people are following through on their promises.
Now, some people say this focus on accountability is just a way to shift blame, as if she's saying the DA isn't responsible for the current state of education. What do you think about that?
Well, it's a valid point, and it brings up all the complications of this coalition government. You have to find a way to balance holding each other accountable while still working together.
Yeah, it's a tricky situation.
It really is. And it takes a certain amount of maturity, a willingness to put aside party politics and focus on what's best for everyone.
Based on what we've heard from Gwarube, do you think she has that maturity? Do you think she can handle that kind of pressure?
I think she does. She's willing to listen to South Africans and their worries. She's focusing on transparency and accountability. She's calling for a spending review. I mean, it seems like she's committed to really fixing education, even if it means going up against the status quo or making some people angry.
Okay, but let's be realistic. She's only been in this job for less than a year. These kinds of changes take time, especially in a system as complicated as South Africa's. Were there any signs that things are getting better, or is it just too early to tell?
It's definitely early days, but I think what's important is that she's changing the conversation. She's bringing something new to the table, a new perspective, new energy, and a new level of honesty. And that's creating hope, a feeling that things really could be different.
And hope is powerful, isn't it? Especially when we're talking about something as important as education. I mean, without hope, it's easy to give in to despair and feel like these problems are impossible to solve. But Gwarube is putting forward a vision of a better future, where every child in South Africa, no matter their background, has access to quality education.
It's a vision that speaks to a lot of people in South Africa, especially those who have been marginalized or left out of the system.
Yeah, we can't talk about Gwarube's vision without talking about the ANC. They're still a major player in South African politics, and they haven't exactly been quiet about their criticisms of Gwarube and the DA's approach to education.
Yeah, it's important to acknowledge that there are different points of view here and understand where the ANC is coming from and why they might be skeptical or even hostile towards Gwarube's ideas.
Well, they've been in church for so long, they have different experiences and priorities. Maybe they see this focus on accountability as a threat to their legacy or their influence.
That's possible. And we should also remember that the ANC has its own vision for education, one that really focuses on social justice and addressing the inequalities of the past. So there's a real clash of ideologies here, a difference of opinion about what the future of South Africa should look like.
So how is Gwarube dealing with that clash? Is she working with the ANC, trying to find some middle ground, or is it more adversarial?
From what she said in the SMWX interview, it seems like she's trying to be pragmatic. She knows that dialogue is important, that building relationships across party lines is important, and finding a way to move forward together, even if it means making compromises.
It's like walking a tightrope, trying to stay true to your beliefs while also recognizing that collaboration and compromise are necessary in a multi-party system.
Exactly. And it takes political skill being able to listen to other viewpoints, understand the subtleties of the issues, and find those areas where everyone can agree so progress can be made.
So it sounds like Gwarube has a huge job in front of her, but she's approaching it with a mix of optimism and realism, this belief that education can really change lives, and a willingness to work within the political system to get things done.
I think you've got it. And it's important to remember that she's not just dealing with policies and politics, she's dealing with people, with kids, whose futures depend on the decisions being made by the government.
It's easy to get lost in these abstract discussions, but in the end, this is about real people with real lives, real hopes, real dreams.
And that's what makes Gwarube's story so interesting. She's not just a politician, she's a human being who truly cares about her country and the people who live there.
And that really comes across in the SMWX interview. You can hear it when she talks about visiting those schools, seeing the problems firsthand, and feeling that weight of responsibility.
It reminds us that even in all the political back and forth, there's a human story unfolding, a story about the fight for a better future, a story about the power of education. And it's a story we should all be paying attention to.
I agree. Before we move on to the last part of this deep dive, I want to come back to something we talked about earlier, the whole South Africans first thing, and how Gwarube seems to be using that message strategically.
Yeah.
How do you think that's landing with people? Is it resonating with them, or is it causing more division?
That's a tough one. There's no easy answer. On the one hand, Gwarube's message is connecting with this feeling of anxiety and frustration that a lot of South Africans are feeling. They feel like they're being ignored. They see the overcrowding in schools. They hear about the lack of teachers. They're watching their own kids struggling. And they're starting to wonder if the system is really working for them.
I get it. When things are tough, It's natural to want to take care of your community, your family.
Of course. But there's a flip side to all of this. This South African's first message can easily be seen as a way to shut people out, to turn different groups against each other, and to encourage xenophobia and intolerance.
Yeah, it's a dangerous path, and it raises questions about the long-term consequences of this kind of approach. Is she accidentally making things worse? Is she trading long-term social harmony for short-term political wins?
These are important questions, and I think it's crucial to have an open and honest discussion about what Gwarube's rhetoric could lead to. We need to recognize that people's anxieties are real, but we also have to guard against the dangers of nationalism that excludes people.
It's a balancing act, for sure.
Yeah.
And it requires careful thought, honest conversation, and a commitment to building a society that's fair and inclusive for everyone.
Exactly. And as we move into the last section of our deep dive, we'll look at these themes in more detail. We'll consider what might happen in the long term because of Gwarube's approach, the difficulties of balancing different needs, and the importance of coming up with solutions that are both practical and ethical.
Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up this deep dive into South Africa's education system. We've been talking about Siviwe Gwarube in her interview on the SMWX podcast. We covered a lot of the GNU, the BLA bill, the underfunding issues, those overcrowded classrooms. What's really stood out to you as we've been unpacking all of this?
It's really interesting how Gwarube's personal journey, like her being a young, first-time minister in this coalition government, seems to be shaping how she's approaching all these issues. It's not just about the practical stuff of education. It's these deeper questions, too, about national identity, how resources are shared, and what it actually means to put South Africans first.
I have to admit, when I first started listening to that interview, I was a bit skeptical. I wasn't sure if this whole South Africans first thing was just a way to get votes, to appeal to a certain group of people, without really addressing the root problems in education. But as we've dug deeper, I'm seeing a more complicated picture.
I think that's a fair assessment. It's easy to brush off phrases like that as just political talk, but I do think Gwarube is genuinely concerned. She's seeing the problems firsthand, the teachers struggling, the parents worried, and it's making her ask some tough questions about what matters most and who's responsible.
Yeah, and it makes us, the listeners, ask those questions too, right? Can a country really prioritize its own citizens without shutting others out? How do you balance this need for national unity with the reality of limited resources and everyone wanting a piece of the pie?
Those are tough questions, and I think that's what makes this whole discussion so interesting. It's not about having easy answers or picking sides. It's about looking at the situation from all angles, understanding the different viewpoints, and recognizing that when it comes to policy, sometimes you have to make compromises.
It's also about empathy, right? Putting ourselves in the shoes of those teachers who have way too many kids in their classrooms, the parents worried about their kids' future, and all those people just trying to get by in a system that doesn't always feel fair.
Absolutely, and that empathy needs to go both ways. We can understand why people who feel left behind are anxious without saying, it's okay to be xenophobic or discriminate against others. We can acknowledge that resources need to be used wisely without blaming people who are just trying to find a better life for themselves and their families.
It's a tough balance, and I think Gwarube, even though she's new to all of this, is handling it pretty well. She's not pretending to have all the answers, but she's asking the right questions, being transparent, and making sure people in power are held accountable.
Yeah, and that's a big deal. It shows that even in a system like South Africa's, where things can feel really stuck, individuals can make a difference. They can speak up, they can challenge the way things are, and they can push for a fairer and more equitable society.
So as we wrap things up here, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. Gwarube's call for a review of government spending, her focus on South Africans, and her push for transparency and accountability. What do you think this all means for South Africa in the long run, for its education system and the country as a whole?
That's a really good question. The choices they're making now will definitely have a lasting impact. Will those impacts create a better, fairer future, or will they just make the existing problems worse?
Only time will tell. But one thing is for sure. The conversation has started, and that's a really important step towards real change.
And it's a conversation we all need to be a part of, not just in South Africa, but everywhere. How do we balance all these different needs and priorities? How do we create systems that are fair and sustainable? How do we build societies that are inclusive and where everyone has a chance to succeed?
These are the questions that will shape our future. And the more we understand and the more involved we are as citizens, the better prepared we'll be to face these challenges and create a world where everyone has a chance to thrive.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into South Africa's education system. We hope this episode has gotten you thinking and inspired you to keep learning about these really important issues.
And until next time, keep searching for those hidden pieces of wisdom, keep asking the hard questions, and keep working towards a better world.